So, Vanashree, why don't you help us understand how does the notion of self-reliance intersect with mindful practices?
So, just to once again reiterate what reliance is, right? So, we know what self reliance is. Essentially, it is that ability to respond in a way that is productive. So that, in our day to day life, when we come across regular challenges, then that it doesn't become so surprising or destabilizing that we are not able to deal with it. So, once we know that that is what resilience or reliance for yourself is, then we can say that what are mindfulness practices? Mindfulness practices are those that keep us on track with what we are doing in the present moment. And so, if in the present moment I am beginning to get destabilized or beginning to feel like I don't feel anymore in control, or this situation is likely to trigger me, that is the idea for us to, that is the moment for us to then consciously and with attention and awareness shift into these mindfulness practices. What are they? We mentioned some of them before. We even did a little bit of grounding, like maybe a minute or two. So we can do grounding, which is first of all feel the safety, security, comfort. That is one resource that we can do as a mindfulness practice. Tracking,
Mhm.
which is, tracking in our body sensations. We are so often dissociated, especially in modern life, with our outer orientation, dissociated with body sensations. So our body sensations is actually the language of the body. The body is constantly messaging us with what's happening within our mind and body, right? We tend to separate mind and body, with our intellect, but actually it's connected. And there is body wisdom constantly giving us the message of when we are feeling dysregulated or about to feel dysregulated. So simply tracking, because mostly we don't even know that that's going to happen. Now just knowing can help us to help ourselves back into resiliency, self-regulation. The other practice that I mentioned before, but we didn't do, is watching the breath. I said before that the breath is the connection between mind and body. But if you don't mind, Pulkit, I can just take us through a 1 minute watching the breath practice. It's secular and it's very mindful, and it's
Uh,
possible at any space.
Sure, sure. Why not? Why not?
Okay, it's going to be a 1 minute thing. So, unless you're driving, this is a safe space for you to practice as you're listening to this episode. So, I'll invite you to just, if you're standing, then sit, plant your feet firmly on the ground, relax your body, and take a position that is perhaps a little more comfortable. If you notice any space in the body where there is rigidity, typically this is at your shoulders, so relax your shoulders, your jaws. Take your mind to your forehead, scalp, lower back, and just relax those muscles there so that we come back into ease. And as we begin, we can just take 2 or 3 long, deep breaths, filling our lungs with our in breath, feeling that nourishing oxygen consciously, and then letting go with our exhalation. Letting go of the carbon dioxide and all the stress, tension, negative thoughts, feelings. Let them go. Drop them. And you might begin to feel a little more centered than before just by doing this. So, for the next few moments, let's come back to normal, natural breathing and watch the normal, natural breath as it comes in and goes out. And you might notice that thoughts keep coming. There will be many more thoughts perhaps coming, and that's okay. The objective of this practice is not to stop the thoughts. Rather, despite having the thoughts, continuing to watch the breath by bringing our mind to the breath. So, in this way, we are training our breath. This is a good mindfulness practice to follow for our self regulation. So, inviting you now, if your eyes were closed, then to open them. But this can be practiced even with your eyes open. So, we are back now. So, that's one more practice.
Thanks a lot, Vanashree, for sharing these amazing practices with our listeners. Now, Vanshi, we have discussed about what is mindfulness, how it impacts our anxiety and stress, even the tools of mindfulness, which we can use to combat with anxiety and stress. But one thing that's really gonna help each one of us out there is the routine that's gonna be built around these tools and understanding of mindfulness. How can we as individuals build our routines and rituals in our lives? Because that's one of the major challenge that every individual faces out there.
Absolutely. And there are specific tools and practices that we can follow. But before we go into those, one of the
Mhm.
key reasons why we stress and anxiety is increasing, that there is actually a sense of isolation that is coming into the world. If you simply take one moment to look at tracing the history of mankind, perhaps the current space that we are in terms of temporal, in time wise, we'll realize that it is one of the most high comfort age that we are in. Everything that we need, we have at our fingertips for most of us, isn't it?
Yeah.
And yet, despite all this, so everything, science, technology, all is working towards making our life more and more comforting, and we are in a comfortable position, yet counterintuitively the stress is more. Why is that? The stress is more because we are actually expecting more and more from our everyday life, from ourselves, and we are putting the stress is coming from within us. We are allowing external circumstances to get to us so that the stress rises. Now, even if nothing else changes outside of you, there is perhaps a situation where you're facing the stress, in your family life, in your work life. There is, if that is a reality for you, despite that happening, we can change that gradually. But in this moment, how can we make a difference to our own life? By changing our relationship to the situation that we find ourselves in. How can we do that? By simply, like, literally finding some time for ourselves. If we are constantly on the move in our thoughts, like I said, ruminating constantly, even though we are sitting in one place, thoughts are going on, buzzing around. That's not a quiet place for us. We actually need to intentionally find a quiet place and ask ourselves, what's the good? Dr. Rick Hansen actually calls this finding the good. Yeah. Which means that in no matter how difficult your life may be, if you begin to look for something good that's happening in your life, the fact, for example, if there is this example of, the person without footwear can find the good by looking at someone who doesn't have feet. So even if you're facing the most difficult, stressful situation, there is always, when you look and begin to find the good, you're likely to find, when you look for it, you'll find it. So we begin to make the effort to find what is good in our life despite the challenges we are facing. Why are we doing that? Not to ignore that there are challenges, not to undermine them, but rather to say that challenges are there, yes, but there are so many good things in our life. Our tendency, human tendency, because of survival, throughout history of man, we have always striven to survive. For hundreds and thousands of years, we were facing so many challenges, before modern man, sort of modern life arrived. So our brains are used to constantly being on a lookout for what is challenging. So we tend to notice that more than what is good around us. The good we tend to take for granted. So the best practice, one of the best ones to begin with, is to begin to look for the good. So for example, right now when I'm sitting, I live in a flat and I
Mhm.
love nature. So how can I look for the good living in a flat? Well, I have plants in my balcony. On every sill in my window, I have plants. And I consciously bring my mind to the plants, and I just enjoy the fact that I have so many plants in my home. You know, now many people have this, and many people do enjoy the fact that they have plants. But unless you consciously begin to bring our mind and enjoy what is around us and intentionally say that this is the good in my life, unless we consciously do that, that's actually not going to be a mindfulness practice. Mindfulness means that we are remembering that this is happening in our current moment. So in this way, there are so many strengths that you have. The fact that you have family, the fact that you have food to eat, all of these are such wonderful practices. So as an example of bringing the good is, there is actually a TED talk, which is, I think, called Thank a Thousand. So there was this person who, had started doing all these mindfulness practices, and he realized how much gratitude helps. Because gratitude is one of the mindfulness practices. One is noticing the good. Second is actually being grateful for this, noticing the good. That I'm so grateful that this is there in my life. So he had started this gratefulness practice in everyday life, and he began by doing this at the breakfast table. So he would, with his family, because he wanted his children to be influenced. And every day morning, he would thank everything, the food that was available on the breakfast table, the farmers, and whoever had cooked. If it was he himself, then he would say, thank you for, allowing me to be there to cook. And if it was his wife or his children who had cooked breakfast, then thanking them. So after this continued for a few weeks, his son, who was 10 at that time, said, he said to his father, you do this on the table, but really, wouldn't it be far better by actually thanking the people who are doing this? So actually going and thanking the farmers rather than just sitting at the table and thanking, saying it out aloud. You know how children can sometimes be insightful in a way that is so meaningful. And this man took it to heart. So he decided to actually do that. And instead of taking the whole, all the food on the breakfast table, he said, I'll just start with a coffee cup on my table. So the thank the thousand is actually thanking everyone who is responsible for that cup of coffee on his table. And he realized that if you actually begin to take count, more than 1,000 people at least are responsible for that coffee cup on your table. The efforts that those 1,000 people put is responsible for your coffee. So can you imagine the expansiveness of the gratitude once you begin to look for it? That so many people are there to support us in everything that we do. The fact that my parents help me, the fact that my teachers help me, the fact that I have a job or that I have my education. Simply being grateful for these luxuries or these qualities, strengths that you do have, raises the positive qualities, the sense of strength in your mind, because all this is about your mind, isn't it? So
Yep.
when you begin to strengthen your mind in this way, the sense of gratitude that you bring actually brings a sense of well-being in your mind and body, and it can reverse the sense of upset, depression, difficult feelings, stress, anxiety. Because if you just look at neuroscience, you know that one positive quality cannot exist at the same time with a negative quality in the same strength. So if your positive qualities are strengthening, then automatically the stress and the anxiety will reduce. So scientifically, it just makes sense for us to, with mindfulness, with intention, with awareness, strengthen the positive qualities. So this is one of the couple of practices that we can follow.
If I'm correct in saying this, with every small step we can start making a routine and rituals in our lives. So it could be as small as starting with the practice of gratitude and making it a regular affair in our life, right?
Yes, exactly. And we don't need to take a coffee cup, for example. But just knowing that, if we spend some time, so gratitude practice needs, it cannot be an, artificial practice in our mind that I simply, oh, how grateful am I? No, you need to actually sit and bring our mind, notice and use the power of your analysis. So you have the strength of logic, analysis to actually put a spotlight on what is it that you would practice gratefulness for. So having a mind gratitude journal helps for that reason, because when you write, then the whole mind, your emotions are all focused on bringing gratitude to the 1, 2, 3 things that you choose for your day. So literally having a gratitude journal at the beginning of the day, you begin with the gratitude journal that, I'm grateful for this. And at the end of the day, you can perhaps be grateful for what went well in your day rather than focusing on what didn't go so well.
Amazing. So, Vanshi, one last question I would like to ask you is, related to everything that we have discussed. And in the previous question, you mentioned about certain external factors coming into picture
Yes.
when it comes to about mindfulness as well. So, how can an individual really look at, combating and curbing the influence of the external factors, specifically the peers or family members? Suppose somebody is going the path that's not trodden. There are going to be challenges for sure. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be full of, different obstacles that are going to come in the picture. At that time, often the support that's required is not extended, but the self-doubt that is not required is stored in the mind of that individual. How can somebody really, battle this out and move towards their own goals that they have set?
Excellent question, and so practical, because this is so necessary to remember what begins to happen when we start practicing either mindfulness practices or any practices that need to get us, or we are doing this consciously to bring us back into well-being. What begins to happen is there tends to happen this binary thinking, which means that either, like before I was in anxiety, now that I'm practicing, I'll be suddenly launched into well-being. It cannot be like that. It's a process, right? We will go up and down. There will be times, even as we are practicing mindfulness, where we will feel as if things are not working. In fact, it is in those times that we need to remember to continue our practice so that we can strengthen the muscle of mindfulness and our own well-being. Now, you said, how can external situations, we can reduce those? So I just wanted to bring an analogy so this becomes easier to understand. What happens is when we are, so for example, just imagine a warrior going into the battlefield, or let's not get into that so drastic. Let's imagine we are going for some friendly match somewhere. And so therefore a match implies that there is an opponent, right? So even if it's a friendly match and you have a friendly opponent, even then, if you're going into that match, you would have put practice before you went in. So if it's a bout of boxing, for example, you would be a boxer who would have done your regular practice, isn't it? So it's not like you would end up in the boxing ring without having done any practice at all. In the same way, the actual practice is not when we are facing the challenging situation, not when we are actually in the battlefield or in the boxing ring. The actual practice to stop these external circumstances from overwhelming us is in everyday life practice. So the actual practice is in times when we are actually not in these challenging situations at all. Now, how can we do that? One of the first things to do is to eliminate the stressors consciously. So, for example, if I know that being with some people, sometimes you have friends and they are more like frenemies. So being with them actually sucks our joy out, or we feel more stressed. Now, knowing, we are not saying eliminate, meaning completely not ever meet them. But if we become conscious that being with these people sucks our energy, then can we reduce as far as possible? Now, if that person is your boss, obviously you're going to work and you cannot avoid that entirely. So what can you do? Strengthen our mindfulness and resourcing muscle every day, consciously knowing that we will need this muscle when we are in the presence of people who stress us out. That's one way. The other is cultivate social support. There will always be, when we feel alone, lonely, then we tend not to, be able to cope so much. The rise of social media, no one actually put their losses on social media. Most people will, not most people, everyone will put their wins on social media. So if we are exposed to social media and consuming it so much that we begin to tend to think that I'm the only one facing challenges, everyone else is happy without any challenging life situations, then it can actually bring in a sense of isolation. So actually, if possible, reduce your social media consumption, reduce screen time, spend time in nature. That actually improves your resiliency in itself. But more importantly, there were these community practices that we have always had, where we can share with friends. Somehow, especially with the younger generation, being with friends is more about sharing wins and everything, and not actually being vulnerable. Because the whole point of friendships is, at times when you need support, that you are okay being vulnerable. So, cultivate that sense of safety with a few people that you feel strong enough to be vulnerable with. That sharing, that support can increase your resiliency. And one last thing I would like to say, all of these are intentional things that we do. There is something called rituals. Our ancestors knew about all this. Our ancestors, it's not like they didn't have stresses in their life. So what did they do in their wisdom? That they started with rituals. These days we seem to think that rituals are something to be done. Acha, this festival has come, now let's just do all this, because this is meant to be done in this festival. The actual practice of having rituals, that ritual can simply be lighting a lamp in the evening. It need not be at an altar. But if the altar makes sense to you, by all means have an altar. Simply lighting a lamp, that ritual is if that is what you choose for yourself, then the point of that ritual is the remembrance. What remembrance? The remembrance to bring yourself back into well-being. So you can keep for yourself a few rituals like these, where you remember to watch your breath. You remember to feel grounded. You remember to see the good. You remember to feel the gratitude. So if you do this many times, for short times, many times through the day, you can actually practice mindfully. So it requires you to remember, right? So you might want to have a list at your work desk, or on your phone. You can set a reminder, so that now several times a day, I'm consciously, for a few minutes or for a few moments, practice these resiliency practices, mindfulness practices, so that I remain in well-being, in order to be able to face the challenging situations when they come up unexpectedly. That's the time where I can actually utilize the skills and the cultivated work that I did when everything was going well. Then your mind can spontaneously come into well-being without your mind scattering or feeling disabled, in some way.
That's amazing, Vanashree. Thanks a lot for sharing your wisdom and some amazing practices. The two practices that you shared, grounding and breath work. Uh, it's going to be really helpful. And listeners, do share your experience with us around both the practices. Vanashree, any last few tips before we wrap up the episode?
Pulkit, I just would like to say one thing, that for listeners who might decide to start a few practices of mindfulness, and I do urge you to at least start with one practice on a regular basis, so that you bring yourself back into well-being. I just like to say that even if you have been doing it for many years, at the end of the day, we are all human, and sometimes you will slip, sometimes you will not remember. The key is not to give up because I'm not able to be regular, because I'm not seeing the benefit immediately. The actual key practice of mindfulness is to just keep at it, little by little, drop by drop, you'll make the ocean.
That's an amazing share, and I totally echo with it. Thanks a lot, Manishi, and thanks a lot, our listeners, for listening to this episode. Please do share your feedback and leave your precious comments with us. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.